Hi, this is part two of the telepathy lecture. And after the couple of silly cartoons that I find funny, um, we get this slide, telepathy and higher order thought theory. So far we've talked about telepathy just in itself, picked out a particular kind as interesting, said a bit about what kind of knowledge it might constitute of other minds, and it emphasised the fact that it involves a direct grasp of a token mental state in someone else's mind. So you could think of it now that we're starting to talk about higher order thought theory, think of there being M1 in their mind. M1 could be a perception of red outside, like we've sometimes made it, or a pain, or it could be a thought now that's unconscious. I don't mind. Think of it as whatever kind of mental state you think is easiest. On higher order thought theory, of course, it's not conscious until the subject has a M2 or high order HOT that represents it, makes it conscious. That makes them aware of that M1. And so prehension on that model would be somebody else becoming conscious of the first person's M1. So subject 1 normally conscious of their M1 in the normal way, and subject 2 becomes directly conscious of that same token M1. That would be the idea of prehension. And maybe you're already seeing how that might fit into HOT theory. So Ned Block in 2011 wrote this paper arguing that Rosenthal's view doesn't work, that it's defunct. But anyway, at the end of the paper, he makes this comment. In the higher order account, in Rosenthal's theory that is, it has to be stipulated that the higher order representation, the higher order thought, occurs at the same time, or at least overlaps in time, and in the same mind as the first order representation it represents. So Rosenthal has to say, in his theory, has to stipulate that the HOT happens at the same time as the first order state. That's obvious. We did say that when we examined his theory. If you had a high order thought that represented some, mental state of yours that you had when you were 5 years old, it wouldn't make that conscious, that state, anymore, because it doesn't exist. So they've got to happen at the same time. But also in the same head, right? Rosenthal's theory is a theory of what makes your mental states conscious. You have a higher order thought representing your own mental states. It's not a theory about other people, it's a theory within your own head to explain what makes some of your mental states conscious and some of them not. So he has to add this point that the higher order thought occurs in the same mind as the first order state. When I read this, I was excited and I thought, well, why would you want to rule that out? So, i.e. that the high order thought could represent something in someone else's head. You can see, I immediately thought, there's telepathy, possibly. If you think about this, the simple self-representational theory where you've got one first order state that becomes its own higher order thought by representing itself, you can see that that's guaranteed to restrict your consciousness to mental states in your own head, because you'd have one state, the low order state, and it's in your head, and if it represents itself, then the thing of which you're aware is also in your head. So that view would restrict your awareness to your own mental states. What would be nice would be one of these theories that could explain, give us a model for telepathy. That would be nice. Then since these are physicalist theories, or at least theories that are closely connected to cognitive science, we'd have a cognitive science model of telepathy. So the point about the Block comment is high order thought theory would allow intersubjective access in principle, i.e. for somebody else, for a second person to become aware of the mental states in your head, since Rosenthal has to stipulate that the high order thought happens in the same head. Think about the rock problem. The problem there was supposed to be that having a thought about a rock doesn't make it conscious, and we discussed reasons why, and so the objection was, and so having a thought about one of your own mental states doesn't make it conscious. But what if the problem with the rock wasn't distance, wasn't the fact that it was outside the head, but just the fact of its rockiness? What if your high order thought, instead of being directed at a rock, was directed at someone else's mental state in the same way that it's directed at your own? And maybe you could higher order thought represent someone else's first order states, and you could become conscious of them in the same way you become conscious of your own. So imagine that they're also doing the same thing, then you would both become conscious of the same M1. Remember that I said we don't really know how, on Rosenthal's theory, he thinks that frontal areas of the brain monitor or sort of scan or represent, say, visual cortex areas, but we don't know how that happens. It could be to do with, it's obviously to do with electrical signals, but it could be to do with magnetic fields, things that could possibly extend outside the head. And if it does require connections, then you could do it with wires. And actually, in a few slides' time, I'm going to give you a possible real-life example where this does happen, where this has actually happened. Okay, so if on this view, high order thought, you could think of your own access to your own mental states as a kind of telepathy within your own head, in a way. If high order thought, so you're directly prehending your own mental states. That's a case of prehension. It doesn't break the privacy of prehension, obviously, because it's still your own mental state. Anyway, if you might think, if you want to model telepathy this way, then you might think of the relationship that your frontal areas have when they're scanning your visual cortex A as a kind of telepathy, just a one man or one woman telepathy. Okay, now what I didn't explain in the lecture was my own theory of my own higher order thought theory, and for reasons I'm going to explain, I think that it's better suited than Rosenthal's to model telepathy. So what I'm going to do now is just quickly explain my theory, and then explain why it's better suited than Rosenthal's to model telepathy. So remember that on Rosenthal's view, we only experience the qualities that higher order thoughts say are there. In a way, first order qualities are irrelevant. We saw that you could remove the first order state, and as long as the higher order thought still said that you were, whatever, in a state of perceiving red, then you would be conscious of seeing red. So in a way, first order qualities are irrelevant. It would be nice to have a theory that allowed us to be conscious of the first order qualities, wouldn't it? Because that was the way I originally set out the high order thought theory. It was supposed to be an answer to the question, what makes M1 conscious? But if all you're conscious of is this kind of light show that the high order thought produces, and you're not really conscious of the thing that it's representing, all you get is its projection, as it were, then that possibly doesn't answer the question of how does M1 become conscious, because the answer seems to be M1 doesn't become conscious. All we get is a kind of projected image, and if we're lucky, then that's correct about how M1 is, but for all we know, it's not. And if you take M1 away, the projection may still persist. So it'd be nice to have a theory that did something to make M1 conscious, where, as it were, the qualia you experienced belonged not to this higher order thought mental projection, but to M1, the qualia that M1 has. On Rosenthal's theory, there are qualia at two levels. The higher order thought kind of generates the appearance of some or makes you experience some, but the M1 also has them, just unconscious qualia. So there's two sets of qualia, it seems. Bloch says there are two layers of qualitative content on Rosenthal's theory. So the thing to do might be to get rid of one of those and make it only the qualia of M1 that are what get into your consciousness. Now, how would you do that? You'd have to take all the qualitative content away from the higher order thought. It would have none of its own. It wouldn't project any qualia, as it were, using this metaphor of the projector. It would be very thin. It would be more like a slot into which the M1 went. It would be something like quotation marks. So something like this first order state is present, or if you prefer talking about M1, this M1 is present with quotation marks, or a kind of slot, and into that slot, into those mental quotation marks. So I'm thinking of some mechanism in the brain, but literally plugging M1 into M2. So M1 would draw a diagram of this. M2 is like quotation marks, and M1, say the red percept, goes in the middle. So M2 says this first order state is here, quote, and in there goes, you know, red percept or whatever. So the whole state together says this first order state is here, seeing red, and that plugging in that mental quotation is, on my theory, what makes M1 conscious, what makes you aware of M1. If it's not mentally quoted, then it's not conscious. It's not displayed, as it were, to your cognitive system. The function of the quotational higher order thought. That's why this is Q-hot theory, quotational higher order thought theory. The function of the M2 on this view is a kind of mental display or cognitive display. It displays the first order state to your mind, and that is consciousness. So in a quotational higher order thought, when it's complete, when you've plugged in an M1, a pain or a visual percept of red or a belief state, all the qualitative content, all that you experience, is supplied by the quoted first order state. So as on Rosenthal's theory, the Q-hot frame, the quotational frame, is not conscious. It's something you're not aware of. What you're aware of is what it quotes. Just like if I say, he said this, get out, never come back. What you're aware of is not my quoting. You're aware of what is quoted. So the function of quotation is to display something else. So the function of these mental quotational higher order thoughts that I posit is to display the first order states. So I've said that you experience whatever's plugged into the higher order thought. The higher order thought itself is unconscious. So think back to the objections to Rosenthal. What happens if there's an empty Q-hot? What if you have a quotational mental frame with no M1 plugged in? Could you have an experience then? We saw Rosenthal says you can, and we didn't like that so much because it meant the first order state's irrelevant. On my theory, you can't have an experience, and we saw that Gennaro tried to say you can't have an experience, but he didn't have a good explanation for why. My theory says you can't have an experience because there's nothing to be conscious of. Just like you can't quote nothing. You can't say he said and not put anything in there. That's not a sentence. So a Q-hot without an M1 is not a conscious state. It's not doesn't give you a successful mental content. You can't be conscious of nothing. Okay, we might think about Zen states of alleged empty